One second. Somebody just chucked something from the second story. Let me make sure that there's no issues over here. One sec. Alright. Only minor damage. Really nothing major, but let's see if they admit to it. I mean, I do have photos and everything. I mean, it's not the end of the day. Nothing's really broken, just a planter or something. But let's see if they take responsibility for it. I guess it's not the end of the world, but it's the kind of thing that, you kind of want to see, like, are they going to do the right thing or not? You know what I mean? Anyways. Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Peidalet, Daf 84 of Masechta Yevamos, So, friends, Daf, we're starting the 9th parak of Masechta Yevamos. It's called Yesh Mutaris. There are those who are permitted. Honestly, I prefer the name of this parak to the name of the previous parak, but Al Koponim, alright. Well, I guess maybe this is representative of new subject matter. I'd be okay with that. Well, we're going to talk about different relations. It's Yevamos, friends. It's still Yevamos. What do you want me to tell you? It's like I don't know what it's... I have ideas what it's like, but I'm not going to share what it's like. But at the end of the day, it's still Yevamos. Even if it's not Perika Orel, but it's still Yevamos. We're talking about Kohen Gadol's, Grushas Vachalutzes, Tcholos, Ptsuadake. What do you want me to tell you? Friends, let's get started. We're on Daf Pei Daled at the beginning of the parak. Yesh mutaris l'valeim v'asuris livmein. There are some relationships where the husband and wife are permitted to one another, but if he goes to Wellwood and then there's Yibum, so the Yibum would be a problem. Mutaris livmein v'asuris l'valeim. There are certain situations where the husband and wife are not permitted to one another, but if the husband goes to Wellwood and then they have to do Yibum, so that would be a permitted Yibum. Mutaris la'elu v'la'elu v'asuris la'elu v'la'elu. And there are some situations where it's okay to be married to each other, and it's okay to do Yibum with each other in the event that Wellwood calls. And there are also situations where they're not allowed to be married to each other, and if Wellwood calls, Yibum is not an option either. Okay, Wellwood. Fine. And the following are permitted to be as a married couple, but if the husband goes to Wellwood, so then Yibum would not be allowed. Kohen Hedjit, Shenosa Salmone. Well, if you have a Kohen, and the Kohen marries a widow, that's acceptable. V'yesh lo ach Kohen Gadol. But his brother is the high priest. Now the high priest is not allowed to marry a widow. So now if this husband goes to Wellwood, so then the high priest is not going to be able to marry his widow. Well, let's call them Reuven and Sarah. We haven't used Reuven and Sarah in a while, but okay. Reuven goes to Wellwood, Shimon is the Kohen Gadol, so you can't do... So in that case, the marriage between Reuven and Sarah is acceptable, but the Yibum between Shimon and Sarah would not be okay. The Gemara is going to ask, even if Reuven wasn't married to a widow, even if he was married to a Basula, still Shimon would not be able to marry her, since once Reuven dies, she's then a widow. Okay, the Gemara is going to ask that. Fine. Fine. Kohen Hedjit, we just read that, right? Kohen Hedjit shenosa samona v'yesh lo ach Kohen Gadol. Next. Chalol shenosa ksheire v'yesh lo ach kosher. What if you have a chalol, meaning a Kohen who's a chalol? Of course, I had a friend in high school, he thought he was a chalol. And so you have a chalol, and he marries a ksheire. Chalol marries a ksheire. Now the problem with that is that since they're married, the assumption is that they're having intercourse, which makes her a halala. So their marriage is okay, but the fact of the matter is that she becomes a halala v'yesh lo ach kosher, and then if Reuven in this case, who's the halal, goes to Wellwood, and Shimon is just a regular kohen, but she's now a halala, and a kohen can't marry a halala, so therefore that becomes a problem. Yisrael shenosa bas Yisrael. If you have a Yisrael who's married to a Bas Yisrael, okay, that's obviously acceptable. V'yesh la'ach mamzer. but the brother Shimon is a mamzer. So the brother Shimon is a mamzer. So of course, if Reuven goes to Wellwood, so even though Reuven and Sarah are allowed to be married because Yisrael and Yisraelis, but if Reuven goes to Wellwood, so then Shimon, who's a mamzer, cannot do yibum with Sarah. Mamzer shenoso mamzeres. If you have a mamzer who's married to mamzeres, that's of course acceptable, right? A mamzer marries a mamzeres. V'yesh lo ach Yisrael, but Shimon, the brother, is a Yisrael who is not allowed to marry a mamzeres, and therefore the yibum would not be okay. Mutarz levaleim vasurus livmein. All of these are examples where the marriage is acceptable, but the yibum is not. Alright, I'm a little distracted now because there's all these workers right outside my window who obviously are making a big mess and they're making noise and stuff like that, and they caused a little minimal damage. But I'm just like a little distracted, like are they going to knock on the door and like say what do we do? Like I'm in the middle of recording, so I'm not really in a position to kind of, make quick decisions. So I'm a little distracted by this. Maybe if they knock on the door, what should I do? Maybe let's make a plan. If these people knock on the door, the thing is, if they knock on the door to say like this happened, I'm not really in a position where like I have to like make a decision. Like I don't want to say like it's okay because then I said it's okay, and that's so. But I'm also not in a position where I can talk about it right now because I'm busy. So I can also just ignore them. If they knock on the door, I just ignore it. I took photos of the broken planter, and like if we want to pursue it later, we can. That's probably what I'll do. I'll probably just ignore them. It's just a little bit distracting. Fine. Anyways, friends, well, if you have any other options, let me know. I mean, by the time you hear this, of course, it'll be about a week too late. But okay, let me know. Next, thanks for helping me out over there. Fine. Next, now the following people are, the yibum would be okay, but when they're married, it's not okay. Now I'm curious, something else just fell. 1 second. Friends, this is life in Eretz Yisrael. People come by to do stuff, and but remember, the payers of Eretz Yisrael are second to none. Okay, so they moved the big box, but I didn't look to check the broken stuff. I'll do that later because I don't want them to see me. I'm busy. Alright. Now, so the following are permitted to do yibum, but not as a husband and wife. So if you have a high priest who marries a widow, that is not allowed. Okay, so that's right. Well, friends, you hear this? Friends, you have to pay attention. Very subtle. He did kiddushin, but not nisuin. If they got married and they had intercourse, so then she becomes a halala. But here they only did kiddushin. Now that's not allowed. But v'yesh lo ach kohen hedjit, and he's got a brother who's a kohen hedjit. So now if the high priest goes to Wellwood, so then his widow, who they never slept with each other, is the assumption. So she's not a halala. So she's just a widow. She could then do yibum with the brother. Kosher shenosa halala. If you have a kohen who married a halala, a kohen who marries a halala, so now that's not okay, right? He's not a kohen and a halala are not allowed to get married. So now v'yeshlo, right? Fine. V'yeshlo ach chalal. Now his brother is a chalal though. So now if he goes to Wellwood, right? Reuven, the kosher kohen who married the halala, which is not allowed. But if Reuven goes to Wellwood, so then Shimon, who's a chalal, can marry his widow who's a halala. Yisrael shenosu mamzeres. If you have a Yisrael who marries a mamzeres, that's not allowed. V'yeshlach mamzer, but his brother's a mamzer. So if the Yisrael goes to Wellwood, so the brother who's a mamzer could marry his widow who's a mamzeres. Mamzer shenosu bas Yisrael. If you have a mamzer who marries a bas Yisrael, that is not allowed. V'yeshlach Yisrael, and he's got so again, mamzer shenosu bas Yisrael, right? A mamzer who is married to a bas Yisrael, so that's not allowed. But v'yeshlo ach Yisrael, but his brother is not a mamzer. So if he goes to Wellwood, the brother who's Yisrael could do yibum with his widow who's a Yisraelis as well. Mutaris livmein basurus levalein. Those are examples where yibum would be okay, but the relationship is not. Ve'elu asuris le'elu v'la'elu. The following are not okay, both as marriage as well as yibum. Kohen gadol shenoso salmona v'yesh la'ach kohen gadol. If a high priest marries a widow, which is not allowed, and he goes to Wellwood, and I guess then his brother becomes the high priest, so his brother would be unable to do yibum, of course, because she's a priest, because she's a almana. O kohen hedjit. Friends, you hear that? Or a kohen hedjit, right? So again, in this case, we're talking about shenosa. Let's read that again. Kohen gadol shenosa es almana. If you have a high priest who marries, i.e. they had intercourse with each other, which makes her a chalala, and then v'yesh la'ach kohen gadol and o kohen hedjit, and then his brother is either also a high priest, right? I mentioned that there's only, that's an interesting question. We did see in Yoma that there could be potentially two Kohen Gadol's in some cases, but maybe we can even talk about where, after the Kohen Gadol went to Wellwood, so his brother became Kohen Gadol, whatever it is. So his brother, of course, would be unable to do yibum with this widow. Now, but even the brother who's a regular Kohen would be unable to do yibum with her, because since the high priest married this widow and had intercourse with her, so then memele she's a halala, and therefore the brother who's even a regular priest cannot do yibum with her. Excuse me. Okay, where am I? Okay, kosher. So a regular kohen shenosa halala, who marries a halala, so that's not allowed. V'yesh lo ach kosher, and he is a brother who's not a halal. So in that case, since he married a halal, so in that case, so kosher shenosa halal, that's not okay. And his brother's also a kosher, which means that they also can't do yibum, because, right, meaning the brother who's a kosher cannot be married to her because he's a halala, and the brother can't do yibum with her either because she's a halala. Yisrael shenosa mamzeres, if you have Yisrael who married a mamzeres, v'yesh lo ach Yisrael, and the brother is also regular Yisrael, so neither he nor his brother would be able to be married to her either by marriage or via yibum. Mamzer shenosa bas Yisrael, or a mamzer who married a bas Yisrael, v'yesh lo ach mamzer, but his brother is also mamzer, so neither he nor his brother would be able to be married to this bas Yisrael. Asuros le'elu v'le'elu, so in those cases, they're not able to be married and they're not able to do yibum. The brothers can't do yibum in the event that Wellwood calls. Anybody want to be buried in Wellwood? Not me. Not me. Not me. And me stomach. I'd prefer to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. Yeah. Yeah. What's the pasuk at the end of Schadish Pnei Adome? Let's go weiter. And all the other situations, so, you can get, in all the other regular situations where people get married and they have siblings, so you can get married, you can do yibum, all sorts of stuff. Fine. Fine. I wonder how much room they have in Wellwood. My dad might know, but he might just know about the Shinover. My dad's, I probably shouldn't say anything. I don't know what he wants me to say or not. Forget I said anything. Forget I said anything. Just forget I said anything. Fine. I'm gonna have to ask my father if I have to delete that. I hope not, because that's extra work for me. Fine. So now we get to shnius. Friends, you remember shnius? Shnius are things that are not technically arise, but midrabanan they arise. So, for example, your mother's mother. Okay. So shnius midivrei sofim. So shnius lebavul, shnius liyavim. So, for example, if you have a guy and he's married to his mother's mother. Okay, let's try not to think about that. Below shnius liyavim, but his brother would not be a situation of mother's mother. Okay, so she's permitted to the husband. so she's forbidden to the husband, but permitted to the yavam. Shnia liyavam v'lo shnia leval. If she is a shnia to the yavam, but not to the husband, so then asur liyavam mutaris leval. So she's permitted to the husband, but forbidden to the yavam. Shnia laze v'laze, asur laze v'laze. If I don't know, like this woman is the mother's mother of both the husband and the brother, then it's a problem for both. Ein lo ksube. Now, in this case, when it comes to shnius, so if you get married to a shnius, so then there's no ksube. So like nichsei malug, for example, he's not chayiv to pay her back for the nichsei malug. It's like some kind of knas. Apparently, we're going to have to explain in the Gemara why the knas seems to be on her. But anyways, in lo ksube, so he wouldn't, if like there's this marriage between shnius larayis, so then she cannot claim the fruits that he ate from the nichsei malug. Lo ksube is nichsei tzon barzel, right? She cannot ask back, right? She cannot, if they get divorced, she can't say, okay, now give me back my nichsei tzon barzel. V'lo peris, nor can she ask to be paid back for the fruits that he consumed of the nichsei malug. V'lo mizonis, he doesn't have to, pay for her food and stuff. V'lo blaos, and also if there's like garments and stuff, she can't ask for them back. That's like a nichsei tzon barzel kind of thing. They have vlad kosher, but at the end of the day, the child is not a mamzer because midoraisa, it's a kosher marriage. Fine. We force them to get, divorced because midoraisa, it's a marriage. Almona l'kohen gadol, or if you have an almone, a widow who marries a high priest, grusha b'chalutzi l'kohen hedget, or a divorcee or a chalutzi marries a regular kohen, a regular priest, mamzeris nisina liYisrael, or a mamzeris or a nisina who marries a Yisrael bas Yisrael l'nosin l'mamzer, or a bas Yisrael who marries a nosin or a mamzer, yishlon ksube. In that case, the taka is a ksube. Okay, so even though it's a lav, there's nonetheless a ksube. Ma'iri detani nose lesne kidesh. Friends, you hear the kasha? Who can tell me the kasha? The kasha is that we said ve'elu mutaris levaleim v'asuris livmein. Right, the following people are permitted to be married, but they're not allowed to do yibum. Kohen hedget shenosa es almona v'yishlach kohen gadol. Right, we said if you have a regular priest who's married to a widow, and we're going to ask in a few minutes why does dafka have to be a widow? Can't it just be a psula also? Anyways, we said if you have a priest who's married to a widow, and then the husband goes to Elwood, and the brother is the high priest. So in that case, so the regular priest, right, Reuven the priest, was allowed to be married to Sarah the widow. But when Reuven goes to Elwood, so Shimon the high priest cannot do yibum with her. Now the question is, why does it have to be that Reuven the priest is married to Sarah the widow? Can't they just be engaged? After all, if Reuven the priest dies and they're just engaged, so then still she's considered a widow, and Shimon the high priest would be unable to do yibum with her anyway. So why do they have to be married? Isn't it enough to just be engaged? Friends, you hear the kasha. Says the Gemara, my area, the Tani Nasa, listen to Kiddush. Why does the Mishnah specifically have to say that they're married? Can't they just be engaged? So v'chitema time in the Nasa, if you're going to say, well, if Reuven the priest is married to Sarah the Almonah, so then there's two things, against this relationship between Shimon the high priest, right? Meaning Reuven the priest is married to Sarah the Almonah, and then the brother Shimon the high priest, if Reuven was married to Sarah, so then there's two strikes against the relationship between Shimon and Sarah, which is, well, if they were married and they had intercourse, so she's no longer a psula, and so that's an essay, right? It says Kim Besula Mi'am Avikachisha, to the exclusion of a Be'ula, and she's a Be'ula. Then also Amona Lesikach, that you're not allowed to take an Amona. So there's an essay and a Losaise. So if we're saying, so the point of Reuven being married to Sarah is that now that they're married, so it's an Asay and a Lota Asay against Shimon the high priest marrying Sarah, and therefore the Asay of Yibum is not strong enough to override the Asay and Lota Asay against marrying Sarah, as we've seen in the past. About Kidesh, but in the case of engagement, so it's just it would be a Lota Asay of Amon lo Sikach, but she is still a Basula if it was from the Erison. So in that case, also essay v'dochel and the essay of Yevamos of Yibum will override the negative commandment of Amon lo Sikach. V'akula pirkin essay v'lo saisei hu v'lo asi essay v'dochel saisei. So, but for the Gemara, that's I hear the logic, but in practice, that's not really going to be relevant because, if you just look at our Mishnah, it's chock full of stuff that are simply a lo taseh. For example, a mamzer or a chalal, right? These are situations of a lo taseh, and still we're saying don't do yibum because the aseh is not tocha the lo taseh. So meaning we don't ask that question by a mamzer, for example. So the fact, the fact that, even if they were just engaged and it would only be a lav of amana lo sikach, that would still be enough, seemingly, for us to say that it's not allowed. So we're still trying to figure out, why do they dafka have to be married? Can it be enough that they are engaged? One second, interesting. Yeah, I'm gonna move this chair. Remember I mentioned the other day the sun was deflecting off the chair, and I said I was a man of action. So I wasn't just going to complain, I was going to do something about it. And friends, I'm going to do that again now. Excuse me, 1 second. Crisis averted. Except that I think the sun actually might be deflecting off the floor, so moving the chair doesn't necessarily help. But let's go weiter. Alright, now that you lost your train of thought. Mishum de kabai lemisnei seifa. So the Gemara answers, why it says that Reuven is dafka married to Sarah, not just engaged? Well, because if you look at the end of the Mishnah, when it talks about what? Right? We were giving examples of situations where the marriage is not allowed and the yibum is not allowed. And it says, Kohen Gadol shenosa es almoneh. And it says there, a Kohen Gadol who marries an almoneh, and it says, V'yesh lo ach Kohen Gadol o Kohen Hedget. And he's got a brother who's either a high priest or a regular priest. So here you have a situation of a Kohen Gadol who's married to an almoneh, and we say that even if he dies, so then you don't do yibum with his brother, even if he's just a regular priest, because they were mamish married. And because they were married, so because, 1 second, there are people talking now, 1 second, it's distracting, 1 second. So in that case, they dafka have to be married, right? Because we're saying that you have this high priest who was married to an almoneh, right? And we're saying that if he dies, even if the brother is just a regular kohen, a kohen hedget, still they would be, the kohen hedget, the brother would be unable to marry the almoneh. Now in general, a kohen hedget is allowed to marry an almoneh, but in this case, dafka because they were married, so she becomes a chalala, and then the brother is not allowed to marry her anymore. So therefore, because in that case we dafka had to say marriage, so davka nasa, so specifically marriage, the shavya chalala, that now she's a chalala and therefore she cannot marry the brother who's just a regular kohen hedget. Aval kidesh sharyale, but if they were just engaged, so she never became a chalala, so then in that case the brother who's a regular kohen would be allowed to do yibum with her. So in that case the davka needs to be married, so she's a chalala, so tananami reisha nasa. So therefore, the first part of the Mishnah, when it says that you have the kohen hedget who's married to the almoneh, so then, if he dies and the brother is a kohen gadol, but it could have been engaged also, but because in the end we're talking about marriage, so in the ratio also we talk about marriage. V'adatani mishum seifa lesnim mishum mitzi also. Fancy, you're the kasha. But why do we have to say marriage? Because at the end of the Mishnah we talk about marriage. What if we look about in the middle of the Mishnah? What do we say? We said, mutaris livmeim v'asuris levaleim. What are examples where the yibum is permitted, but the marriage is not? So kohen gadol shakidesh es almonah. If you have a kohen gadol who is mekadesh and almonah, so the marriage is not allowed. V'yesh la'ach kohen hedget, but the brother's a kohen hedget. So she could then do yibum with the brother. Now that's dafka where they were engaged, because if they were married, then she would be a halal and she would not be able to do yibum with the brother. So their dafka, it's talking about where they're engaged. So effectively, Gemara, how come we're jumping to the end of the Mishnah where it talks about marriage, and therefore because the end of the Mishnah talks about marriage, the beginning of the Mishnah needs to talk about marriage. But if we look in the middle of the Mishnah, it's talking about engagement. So why don't we compare it to the middle of the Mishnah, say it's talking about engagement, and therefore let's talk about engagement in the first part of the Mishnah as well, right? Right? Lesni mishum mitziasa, kohen gadol shekidesh es almana, kohen gadol does kiddushin with a widow. V'yesh lo ach kohen hedget, so that's of course not allowed. The kohen gadol is not allowed to be with the widow, but they only did kiddushin. V'yesh lo ach kohen hedget, and there's a brother who's a Kohen Hedjit, so if he goes, if the Kohen Gadol goes to wellwoods, then the brother could do Yibum, and therefore there it's Dafka engagement. So again, so why in the Reisha do we talk about marriage? First we want to say, well, because the Sefer talks about marriage, but in the middle of the Mishnah it talks about engagement. So Kilu, I don't know, why compare it to the Sefer? Compare it to the middle. So Elam Mishum Bas Buksa. Rather, no, the reason why the Reisha of the Mishnah mentions marriage is because if you look at the very next case in the Mishnah, what's the very next case in the Mishnah? Chalol shenasa kshere v'yesh lo ach kosher. That if you have a chalol who marries a kshere and he has a brother who's just a regular old Kohen, so in that case it's dafka marriage, because if it was only engagement, then she's a kshere, right? Meaning it's dafka through marriage and they have intercourse, then she becomes a chalala, and in that case she's not allowed to marry the brother. But in this case, in this case, Dafka, they were married, and therefore she's not allowed to do Yibum with the brother who, right, because she becomes a Halala, then she can't do Yibum with the brother who's a Kosher Kohen. So therefore, since in that case it needs to Dafka be marriage where she becomes a Halala, so therefore in the ratio we also mention marriage. So again, Mishum Bas Buksa, because of the neighboring case, the Kabbalah Misneh Chalol Shanos a Kshere, a Chalol who marries a Kshere, so they're allowed to be married together, but she becomes a Halala. So, Taima Denosa, the reason is because they're Dafka married, the Shavi Halala, Aval Kidesh, but if they would be engaged Shariale, then she would be allowed to do Yibum with the brother. So therefore, because in that case we Dafka had to mention marriage, Mishum Hachi Katani Nasa, that's why it mentions marriage, and that's why also by the Reisha, by the Kohen Hedjid who marries a Amona, it's talking about marriage as well, and not simply engagement. Oh, so now Frek the Gemara, my Irya de Katani Amona Lesni Besula. Oh, friends, you hear the Kasha? What? No, as I pointed out at least once before, the first clause in the Mishnah, it says that if you have a Kohen Hedjit, Reuven's a Kohen Hedjit, and he's married to a widow, so then if he goes to Wellwood, his brother who's a Kohen Gadol cannot do Yibum with Sarah, his widow. The thing is, even if Reuven was married to Sarah and Sarah was a Besula, still, the fact of the matter is, when they get married and then Reuven goes to Wellwood, she's now a widow. And even if when they got married she was a Besula, the fact of the matter is, now that Reuven's in Wellwood, so Sarah is a widow, and because of that, Shimon the high priest cannot do Yibum with her anyways. So why does it matter that Reuven was married to Sarah who's an Almoneh? Even if she was a Besula, Shimon the high priest would be unable to do Yibum with her. So, in fact, the Gemara, my iri de Katoni Almona, the Snei Besula. How come the Mishnah Dafka mentions that Reuven's married to a widow? Even if he was married to a Besula, Shimon the high priest would be unable to do Yibum with her, because at the end of the day, when Reuven dies, she becomes an Almona. V'chitema k'sover haitano nisuna rishonim mapilin. And if you're going to say, well, maybe this Tana holds that we go based on the state at the time of the marriage. And therefore, if at the time that Reuven married Sarah, she was a Besula, so then she would be able to do Yibum with Shimon the high priest. And therefore, we have to say that it was talking about that at the time that Reuven got married to Sarah, she was already an Almoneh. She was already an Almoneh. But if at the time that they got married she was a Besula, so then Shimon would be able to do Yibum, but Harei Chalol, Shnosek Kshere. But what about we had a situation of a Chalol who marries a Kshere, and we say that if the Chalol goes to Wellwood, so then the brother who's a Kohen, a regular Kohen who's not a Chalol. Oh, 1 second, there's people talking loudly again, 1 second. Okay, they stopped temporarily. So we say in that case, so in that case, if a Chalol marries a Kshere, so then the brother, who's a regular Kohen, is unable to do Yibum with her, right? Because she became a Chalala when they got married. When the Chalal marries the Kshere, now they have intercourse, then she becomes a Chalala, and maybe she can't do Yibum with the brother anymore. But if we're saying that it's based on the time when they got married, but at the time they got married, she was a Kshere. So clearly we're not doing it based on the time that they got married, okay? We don't say that we go based on the time that they got married. Havada mishum seifa. So in this case, the reason why we say almana is definitely has to do with the seifa, with later on in the Mishnah, mishum dekabar the Mishnah seifa. What do we say later on? Kohen gadol shenasa es ha'almana v'yesh lo ach kohen gadol oy kohen hedget. Because we said that in a situation where a kohen gadol, a high priest, marries an almana, which is not allowed, and then the high priest goes to wellwood, so even if his brother is a regular priest, so they'd be unable to do yibum, and there it's dafka because a kohen gadol married an almana. If she was a besula, then that would be completely fine. So dafka almana av besula chazile. If the brother is a regular priest, he'd be able to marry a besula who's now an almana. That's no problem. Mishumachi ketani almana. So therefore, because in the Sefer Davka it was talking about an almana, a widow, so therefore we mentioned the ratio also a widow. But yes, technically speaking, it could have worked with a besula as well. That if Reuven's a regular priest, he's married to a besula and he dies, and now she's an almana. Still, the kohen gadol, the brother of the high priest, would be unable to do yibum with her because she's an almana now. Now says the Gemara, Maskefler of Papa. So Papa asks a kasha. If we in fact paskin, if we in fact rule, like the following statement that Rav Dimi taught in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Mitzri Sheni, Shenosa Mitzris Rishona, Bina Sheni. Friends, we learned recently about the Egyptians marrying into the congregation. We said that, converting to Judaism, and then we said for the first 2 generations, once they convert, they are not allowed to marry into the congregation, but from generation 3, they are allowed to marry into the congregation. Now, if we rule in accordance with what Rav Dimi said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, which is that a Mitzri who's a 2nd generation convert, who marries a 1st generation Mitzris, their child will be a 2nd generation, right? Because the child is born to a 1st generation Mitzris, so the child becomes a 2nd generation. So B'sheni have. So listening nami. So then we're missing a case in the Mishnah. We should also, right? The Mishnah was listing all sorts of situations where the marriage is permitted, and then maybe the yibum, right? Maybe the marriage is permitted or not permitted. The yibum is permitted, not permitted, right? So what? Let's talk about mitzris. Mitzri sheni shenotza shtei mitzriis. What if you have a mitzri who's a sheni, a 2nd generation mitzri convert, who's married to 2 mitzriis? Achas rishona v'achas shniya. One is a 1st generation mitzvahs convert, and the other is a 2nd generation. And they have children. Right? So you have a 2nd generation mitzri who's married to a 1st generation mitzvahs and a 2nd generation mitzvahs. They have children, which means that the children of Mele are respectively a 2nd generation mitzri and a 3rd generation mitzri. Right? So now, inosiv ki or chayu. So if the 2nd, right, so I guess assuming that there are boys, let's say, so you have a 2nd generation boy and a 3rd generation boy. So if the 2nd generation marries a 2nd generation girl, and the 3rd generation boy marries a 3rd generation girl, right? Because a 3rd generation basically marries a Bas Yisrael, right? So meaning a 2nd generation Mitzri convert boy marries a 2nd generation Mitzris convert girl, and the 3rd generation marries a Bas Yisrael. So Mutarus Levailein. So in that case, Mazel Tov, right? The 2nd generation Mitzri can be married to 2nd generation Mitzris. The 3rd generation Mitzri can now marry into the congregation. So they're permitted to their husbands. Vasuris li'av meim. But what happens if the 2nd generation Mitzri goes to wellwood? So now the 3rd generation Mitzri is going to have to do yibum with the 2nd generation Mitzri, but that's not okay. Or if the 3rd generation Mitzri goes to wellwood, so in the 2nd generation Mitzri is going to have to do yibum with a Bas Yisrael, which is also not okay. V'i ipuch, and if you do the opposite, where the 2nd generation married a Bas Yisrael and the 3rd generation married a Mitzri Sheni, so then the marriage would not be okay. But if they respectively go to wellwood, so then yibum would be okay. Right? V'nasuv mutaris li'av me'en, yibum would be okay. V'asuris l'vailein, but marriage would not be. Mutaris la'elu gioris. What would be an example where marriage is permitted, yibum is permitted? Well, if they married converts, right? If the 2nd generation Mitzri married a Gioris, so assuming that a Mitzri, that Gioris is not considered Kohol, so then a second generation Mitzri would be allowed to marry a Gioris, and also obviously a third generation Mitzri who's allowed to marry into the congregation would be able to marry a Gioris, because, Gioris can marry, a regular Gioris can marry anybody. Well, not a Kohen, I guess. But anyways, so in that case, everybody, right, this Gioris would be able to marry a second generation Mitzri, third generation Mitzri, no problem. So both, everything would be permitted. Asuris le'elu v'le'elu ailonis. But if an ailonis, right, so for example, if you have a second generation Mitzri who marries a ailonis Bas Yisrael, so he's not allowed to marry Bas Yisrael, and if if the second generation Mitzri goes to Wellwood, so then she would be unable to do even with the third generation Mitzri, because the whole point is to make a name for the brother, and she's not able to have children, so there won't be a name. So in that case, she's not allowed both to be married as well as to Yibum. So Frekta Gemara, why is this case of the Mitzris not included in the Mishnah together with all these marriages and Yibums and permitted and forbidden? Tana v'Shayr. So Gemara says, good kasha. Good flippin' kasha. You know why it's not in the Mishnah? It should be. It could be. The Mishnah left it out. It didn't give every example. It left it out. My shire, die shire. Well, what else did it leave out? What else did it leave out? Okay, apparently it didn't list anything. It's not a comprehensive list. What else did it leave out? Shire p'tuadaka. Left out a p'tuadaka. Right, p'tuadaka is right. They're not allowed to marry into the congregation. But if there's a brother, the brother would be okay, etc. But if the brother is also p'tuadaka, then would it be okay, right? All that kind of stuff. So Mishum p'tuadaka lav shiur. No, p'tuadaka. No, that it's not leaving out p'tuadaka. Datana le chayve lavin, because the Mishnah, after all, did mention chayve lavin, things that are prohibited, and p'tuadaka is prohibited. Atu chayve lavin milo katani v'adatani. Yeah, but the chayve lavin, it mentioned a whole bunch of chayve lavin. Mentioned mamzer, mentioned cholos, all sorts of things. And yet it left out p'tuadaka. So we see that p'tuadaka was left out. So v'akatani, where am I? Right, v'akatani koyin hedjit shenasa amone. Right, after all, right, we had different lavs, right? We mentioned the koyin hedjit who's married to amone, and there's the brother who's the high priest. V'cholol shenasa ksher, and there's the brother who's cholol who marries a ksher, and then she becomes a cholala. Then there's a brother who's a koyin kosher, right? So we talked about different lavin in the Mishnah. Yeah, but it's tzrichale lashmu'inan could do Rav Yehuda. Yeah, but we need those cases to teach us, like Rav Yehuda Amarav, the Amar Rav Yehuda Amarav, lohuzaru ksheris li nasi levsulin. That when it comes to like chalols and stuff, the problem is with a kohen, a kosher kohen marrying a chalala. That's not okay. But a kosher girl or a kosher kohenes or a Bas Yisrael, anybody, is allowed to marry a chalal. That's okay, right? It's that a kohen is not allowed to marry a chalala, somebody who's not allowed to marry, but a kohen who's a chalal is allowed to marry a ksher. Fine. And that's fine. So that's what we learn now from the fact that we mentioned the chalal shenasa ksher. But still, v'akatani chalal shenasa ksher v'yisrael shenasa bas Yisrael v'yesh lach mamzer. But we also talked about if you have Yisrael who's married to Yisrael and there's a brother who's a mamzer, which is a lav. How come we needed to do that? How come we need to teach that? What's special about that? That just seems to be like a random lav that we're including. And why didn't we also include p'tuadaka? Sounds like we left out things. Hanami lo mahader misna hi. No, that's also not just random. Dashmina, because it's letting us now know. Lav she'ein shava bakol v'kamashmalon lav shava bakol. Because up until now we were talking about things that are not equal to everybody. We're talking about kohanim, kohen gadol, regular kohens. Those are only, relevant for specific groups of people, kohanim. But now we're saying mamzer. Mamzer is something that can be shaykh to anybody. So also we're not wasting an example there. It's necessary. But Akatani Yisrael Shenasa, so here we could change things around. But Yisrael Shenasa Bas Yisrael V'Yishlach Mamzer. But what about, we also mentioned that if you have a Yisrael who's married to a Yisrael and there's Yisrael is married to a Bas Yisrael and there's a brother who is a Mamzer. Sorry, I'm just looking something up. Yisrael Shenasa, wait, V'Yishlach Mamzer. No. V'Akatani Yisrael Shenasa Mamzer is V'Yishlach Yisrael. Right, so in that case, I don't know why they switched that around. But anyways, right there, so there are other cases of mamzer as well. Why did we have to list those? So rather, it does seem that the Mishnah is listing a whole bunch of lavin, even though it didn't necessarily need to learn out specific things from those lavin. So it sounds like the Mishnah is listing a whole bunch of things, but it is not a comprehensive list, and therefore Psuadaka was left out, but also Mitzri is left out, it was not a comprehensive list. Friends, we're going to stop here for Daf Pei Daled. That was sort of the beginning of the ninth parak of Masechta Yevamos. We're moving along over here. We're already in the middle of the pays. Friends, we're really moving along here in Masechta Yevamos. We talked about all sorts of situations where marriage is allowed, Yibum's not allowed, Yibum's allowed, marriage is not allowed, all sorts of these configurations that we're sort of getting used to learning about Masechta Yevamos. Friends, that was Daf Pei Daled of Masechta Yevamos. I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.